What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we'll be doing a camera comparison test between the new Samsung Galaxy M31 and the Samsung Galaxy A51. Now, I think this is going to be a really interesting comparison because what we have here is the mega monster M31 that touts some crazy new camera specs versus the widely popular and really solid A51, which seemingly doesn't have as good of hardware while somehow still coming in at a higher price. Obviously, there's a lot to consider here, and I'll get into some real-world side-by-side picture and video samples so we can see what these phones can do. But I do want to take just a minute to sort of go over the hardware and software features of each device, just so that we know what we're working with. If you're not interested in that stuff, I completely understand, and feel free to fast forward through this part of the video or look for the timestamp in the comments to jump straight to the pictures. So like I mentioned, the new Samsung Galaxy M31 has been nicknamed the Mega Monster, mainly because of its brand new 64 megapixel f1.8 aperture main camera lens. In comparison, the A51 offers a still respectable but seemingly less capable 48 megapixel f2.0 aperture main shooter. And while the difference in main lenses is probably what most people focus on, it actually isn't the only difference. The wide angle lens on these two phones differs as well. The M31 has an 8 megapixel f2.2 shooter, while this time the A51 has the advantage with a 12 megapixel f2.2 wide angle lens. Now, the rest of the camera setup, the other two lenses, those appear to be the same for both devices, and they include a 5 megapixel macro lens for up close pictures and the 5 megapixel depth sensing camera for shallow depth of field live focus photography. I realize though that specs and megapixels aren't necessarily everything. There are a ton of other factors to consider. So while some things may seem one way on paper, it's really going to come down to a combination of things that allow these phones to produce a picture that looks a certain way. And we'll do some critiquing here in this video in just a second. In regards to the front-facing selfie cameras, we also seem to have a difference here as well, though the advantage isn't quite as clear. The M31 has a 32 megapixel f2.0 aperture lens, while the A51 has a 32 megapixel f2.2 aperture lens. Though I don't know the specifics of what kind of hardware specifically exists in each of these lenses, whether it's newer, older, reused, better, or whatever. Of course, like I said, the actual camera specs, like the megapixels and aperture, that's usually just one part of the equation, and there are some other things to consider. But those other things usually include like the processor of the phone, for example. Better, more powerful processors tend to help with image processing, but in this case, we actually have the same setup, the Exynos 9611 chipset in each phone, so no advantage there. The GPU and RAM are also the same as well. And on the software side of things, we get the same experience, with both phones running Android 10 and One UI 2. So they each have the same controls, features, and shooting modes, which I used for different picture samples, including night mode, live focus, some pro controls, macro, and more. And I'll make sure that I have each shooting mode labeled so you know what's going on in the pictures. But aside from those little differences in actual camera hardware, the playing field seems to be fairly even. Also, just a note, in order to take full advantage of all those megapixels, you'll need to make sure you select the proper shooting mode for each phone. Otherwise, you're just stuck shooting with like 12 or 16 megapixels by default. In my camera tests, I didn't always shoot at the max settings, but when I did, I made sure to label them, and I think the most noticeable thing about bumping up the shooting mode here is just the amount of detail you get from the actual pictures. So enough talking, let's jump right into some side-by-side comparisons. Now, right off the bat, with just a regular old picture, the thing I noticed at first is actually just how close these two phones really are. In a lot of instances, the side-by-side pictures look really comparable, and there isn't always a significant difference or a clear winner, which is kind of interesting. I know there's a lot going on in this picture, but in this case, I don't think either phone has an advantage, and I don't necessarily see anything I can call out right away. With this picture, however, there are quite a few things I can see. First off, the A51 went with a brighter, more exposed shot, and also seemed to saturate the scene a bit more. Perhaps a little too much, since it doesn't quite look as true to life as it really was. While the M31's image may not look as appealing to the eye, I think it's a more accurate representation of the true scene. Furthermore, I think this is a great example in capturing the differences in detail with each phone. The M31 M31 to me seems to have been able to retain more detail, especially in the flowers on the rider's chest and arms, while the A51 loses out a bit and makes the texture not nearly as prominent. You can also see on the saddle, I think the Bellagio logo and subtle patterns and designs are retained more with the M31, and while they're still present with the A51, they're just not as clear. Here's another example where once again you can see the M31's ability to capture more detail. In this instance, the lines on the stone look sharper with the M31, the textures are more apparent, and I think the relief pops from the wall more than what we can find on the A51. Now, I mentioned earlier that in addition to the main lens being different on these two phones, the ultra-wide lens was also different. And with a side-by-side picture, I think you can really see the product of those varying hardware lenses. Here's what we have with the main lens, of course, a bit different white balance and color temperature, but nothing too crazy. And here is what we get with the ultra-wide angle. Right away, you can see the M31 totally loses the shadows and dark areas. It almost turns them entirely black while taking a super saturated approach overall as well. And you can see that in the sky and in the water especially. Overall, I don't think the M31 did a bad job necessarily, just that the A51 seems to have better dynamic range with the ultra-wide lens, which in this case yields a significant difference. When we move to the front-facing selfie cameras, I think the results here are pretty similar as well, and both phones do a nice job overall. I like the skin tone. It's maybe a little more pale on the M31, but not by much. There's good detail with each image, not a whole lot of skin smoothing, which is often an issue with certain Samsung phones, and all in all, I don't really have anything negative to say. With a live focus selfie, again, I don't see a whole lot that's different between the pictures. I think they both did a good job separating the subject from the background, especially around my hair, which I know is sometimes tricky. I think both phones do make me seem a bit more pale than even the standard selfie, which is interesting, but again, the detail isn't lost. There's no crazy beauty mode happening or anything like that. It's just a good solid result. When the lights go down and we start to utilize night mode, the main thing I notice is the fact that the A51 can seemingly bump up the exposure and brightness a bit more than the M31 can, and ultimately reveals more details that get lost in the shadows. Now, for the overall picture, I'm not sure I like the brighter, overexposed look in night mode, but I can at least acknowledge the A51's ability to do better in the dark and offer a bit more usability with the final image. So I do have a ton more picture and video samples here to show you guys, and I don't want to torture you with my voice any longer. I'm going to go ahead and let them all play through so you can do some critiquing of your own. Let me know what you think of these samples, and I'll meet back up with you guys at the end of this video. All in all, I think what surprised me the most is the fact that oftentimes the M31 can be better than the A51. That's not unexpected necessarily since the hardware is there, but the thing to consider is the fact that the A51 is the more expensive and seemingly more premium device. In the end though, I don't necessarily agree that you're getting more by paying more. I think the M31 is justified in its mega monster nickname. It takes fantastic pictures, especially at its price point. And if I can save some money and get a comparable and in some instances better picture taker, I'm gonna go ahead and go with the M31. But let me know what you guys think. Which phone did you prefer? I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.